Living in North Carolina, hunting is more than just a hobby for me. I get out there for 2 seasons every year, do my part to cull all the vermin, and fill up my freezer. Many of my buddies do the same thing. I know this isn't a lifestyle unique to the Carolinas, but I wanted to make it very clear early on in the story that a lot of the people involved are experienced hunters and not fair weather weekend warriors. I have been hunting in these woods for years, ever since I was a boy. My father used to bring me here, teaching me the ways of the wild and the thrill of the hunt. Now, I come back every year, solo or with friends, to relive those memories, to also make new ones. The public land that I hunt on are vast and unforgiving, a tangle of overgrown forest and winding streams. Some folks might like to call them backwoods, but I know better. There's beauty in the wild, even if it is a little rough around the edges. This year I did all the scouting solo, but the hunt itself was with my buddies Don and Kyle. Don was just along for the ride, happy to provide camp support and swap stories by the fire. Kyle, on the other hand, was here for a kill. He'd been practicing his shot all summer, was itching to take down a buck. Since I was the one doing the scouting, the fellows put their faith in me, let me choose the campsite, and I had the perfect place in mind. We took the usual drag in our trucks and followed that dirt road until it petered out, which left us at the back end of a woodland, the south side of the valley that we'd be hunting in. We parked the truck on one side of the road but hauled our gear to the other. There was a perfect campsite atop a ridge on the opposite side of the road. This would allow us a great vantage point of the area, overlooking everything in all directions. We could see down the road and keep a tab on other hunters or hikers. Obviously, see our trucks down below us. It had a great fire pit, which we got a healthy load of wood for immediately. Then went about setting up our tents, the tables, and then everything else we might need for the next few days. By sundown, we'd had a few beers, ate a quick dinner, and settled in to listen. We swapped some stories and heard some distant sounds before all getting tired and bored out there in the dark. We went to bed at a decent hour, eager to get up before the sunrise and start out on the hunt. As I slowly drifted off to sleep, I thought that I heard distant music, almost like a guitar playing this slow, mournful tune. At first, I thought it was just the wind or maybe my imagination, but then I heard it again, faint but unmistakable. How weird is that? I remember thinking to myself. So far away, it was hard to tell what it actually was, because there was no way it could have been a guitar. It just didn't add up. I just laid there, listening intently, wondering if somebody was playing some kind of prank on us. But the music seemed too far away, too ethereal, to be anything man-made. I don't really know how else to explain it. I tried to shake it off, because slowly, a feeling of unease was creeping up. But I immediately told myself it's just my imagination, running wild. Not long after that, I heard the shuffling of feet, crunching through leaves on the outskirts of our camp. My heart skipped a beat. I sat up in bed, now listening intently. Don hollered out from his tent. "Hey, was that either of you guys? You out of your tent?" I hollered back to him. "No, I'm still in here." The footsteps stopped and an uneasy silence immediately fell over the camp. Kyle never called back. We could actually hear him snoring from his tent just a few feet away. He was a notoriously heavy sleeper, always drank way more than we did, so this really wasn't out of the ordinary. Still, it was creepy, because we knew it wasn't him. Something else was making all those weird sounds that we were hearing. When Don and I spoke, they immediately went away. I just laid there for a while, listening. There was nothing. No more music, no more footsteps. I tried to convince myself it was a rodent or another vermin. I was curious about our camp, came up, heard the noise, and then lost interest. The feeling of unease just lingered, like a shadow in the corner of my mind. When we woke up a few hours later, Don and I checked the perimeter of the camp, looking for any signs of disturbance, but there was nothing. No footprints, no tracks, no evidence of anything out of the ordinary. So we chalked it up to an animal. Something had wandered into camp and then lost interest. As we prepared our gear and then slung our rifles over our shoulder, a feeling of being watched had now consumed me. I looked around and the trees seemed empty, the wind rustling through the leaves like a gentle whisper. Again, I had to remind myself, it's just my imagination. You're just spooking yourself. The music, the footsteps, it had all been a part of my imagination playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew better. Something was off, something that I couldn't quite put my finger on. I had to remember we're in the middle of nowhere. Of course we're being watched. All manner of wildlife surrounded us for miles and miles in every direction. We were the newcomers. There were probably at least a half a dozen beady little eyes on us at all times. Did my best to just flush away my emotions and focus on the hunt. This is what we came out here to do. Kyle went one direction, and Don and I hoofed it in the other. We took opposing routes into the valley. Don was going to switch back between us as we combed through. "Hey man, did you hear that last night?" Eventually I whispered over to him. I couldn't get it out of my head. I figured talking to Don might nip it in the bud. "Yeah, that was me that hollered," he explained. "The footsteps, is that what you're talking about?" No, before that," I clarified. "I heard like this weird faraway music." Don shook his head. "I didn't hear that part." As soon as he said that, we both heard a perfect ring through the trees. The only way I can really describe it to you is almost like a bell harmony. It rang for a couple of seconds and then went completely silent. Don and I shared another look, but just continued on through the thicket. Sitting still wouldn't do any good if we couldn't see what was making that noise. We moved through a clearing and up a ridge, but didn't find anything. Don explained he was going to cut straight across from here and meet up with Kyle, who he figured was due west of us. We came up with this loose itinerary for him to come back to me, probably in a mile and a half or roughly 1 hour's time. Don slipped out down the ridge and then disappeared from my sight. I stayed up on the ridge and actually nestled in for a bit. I figured Don's walking might kick up some critters. Maybe something would come walking by me. Plus, I hiked a little quicker than those two. I didn't zig and zag as much. So I really wouldn't need as much time to reach that rendezvous point that Don and I had agreed upon. I sat up there with my eyes peeled for 20 minutes or so. I didn't catch sight of anything, not even a bird. So eventually I passed down that ridge and back into the forest again. I walked onward, dead silent for a good stretch before briefly passing through this marshy area. I wasn't really familiar with that area either. There's a lot of standing water from previous rain, and it turned that little part of the woodland into something overgrown, dark, and murky. There really wasn't a lot of terrain, but boy did it stand out. I passed through that area, through the forest until I spotted this big rocky vista that I knew would be ahead of me. It's a pretty cool terrain feature out there, one that attracts a lot of random wildlife. It has vegetation, shade, and little pools of water. I snaked between some boulders and sure enough, who do I spot ahead of me? A pair of bucks, roaming along side by side. They were filled out handsome boys, so I put all my focus into staying silent and dialed in. I took a knee and shouldered my rifle, looked long down my scope at the deer right in front of me. I'd say something like a 100-yard shot, nothing too wild. I waited though, as they were restless and moving a lot. So finally, the larger one gave me his broadside. Once I pulled the trigger, the report from the rifle absolutely flattened the wilderness around me, and the buck too. The other one exploded into a run and disappeared into the trees, just like Don had earlier. I checked my watch and saw that it was only 15 minutes until he was supposed to come back my way. Perfect timing, all things considered. I approached my kill and couldn't help but smile. It was dead, no struggle, and pretty much instant. I was very satisfied to have my kill so early in the hunt. Even earlier in the day, time was on my side. There was very little in the way of mess too. I took off my gear in the clearing and made some space to work. I went about doing it slowly though, thinking Don would come spilling out of the trees at any second. When he didn't, I really thought that was odd. I mean, everybody heard that gunshot for at least a mile or two. They were both well within that distance, so I kind of expected them both to come barreling out. Then it occurred to me maybe they were locked up in a hunt of their own. There could be all manner of deer along the other side of that canyon floor. They might even be in some kind of hot pursuit. I decided to kill a little bit more time, so kicked up my feet and ate a little bit of my snacks that I brought with me. Wanted some energy before I did the duty of field dressing my kill. Maybe 10 minutes later, I thought I heard Don in the woods behind me. The sound kept getting closer until I finally turned around to wave, but there's nobody there. Whatever I was hearing now seemed to be fading off. Immediately, I got the chills. I just tried to remain cool, told myself Don's adrenaline was probably cranked up. He accidentally wandered right by me. I let out this short, crisp whistle, really loud one. Expected to hear one coming bounding back toward me. I didn't. Now I was really getting weirded out to the point of maybe firing a round off, just to see if anybody would fire one back. Instead, I grabbed my backpack, threw it on, and went barreling after Don, or at least near as what I based those sounds were coming from. Again, I expected to see him, bumbling my way after a few minutes, but there wasn't anybody. Frustrated, I pushed on, even redirected my course to get further north, where I suspected they had to be. I came around a bend and somebody hollered at me. It was Don. I looked up the hillside and he was up there, partially hidden behind a downed tree. He started to slog down to me, and after a minute, I spotted Kyle doing the same. I guess I walked right through their hunting path, botched the things for both of them. "You guys see anything?" "No deer, just some fucking weirdo," was all Kyle said. I arched an eyebrow and turned to Don. "Did you see the guy?" he asked me. I shook my head and prompted them to go on. "You want to tell him?" Don asked Kyle, who shook his head. But Don went on. "Well, after I left you, I started winding upward to catch up with Kyle. After a mile of switchbacking, I caught a little trail, easy enough to follow. I figured it was maybe 15 minutes behind him. Well, I go a little quicker, and when I come around some trees, I see him. Except it wasn't me," Kyle chimed in. "Right," Don clarified. "I saw somebody moving through the brush, silent. I figured it was Kyle. Only when I start getting close do I realize it's a totally different guy." "Well, what was he doing?" I asked, skin prickling at the thought. "Well," Don said, "he was following me." Kyle finished it off. I could feel pins and needles settling into my skin. The hell did I just walk upon? I barreled my rifle across my chest and took a look around. The place seemed to be desolate, nobody else around. Still, there's something in the air. That same feeling from earlier. With the story that these two guys just told me, I knew I was onto something, and I knew that feeling was right. Here's the absolute truth though. If it had been just Kyle and I out there, and he told me that crazy story, I honestly wouldn't have believed him. He was a tall tale type of guy, loved his drinking stories, and if you let him chat you up, he'd tell you doom was just around the corner. It was all the fact that Don was the one that was telling me this, having done most of the witnessing. Don was a part-time pastor, truly one of the most honest men you could ever know. If he said somebody was out there sneaking around, I believed him. We all start comparing notes. Don and I told Kyle about those weird sounds that we heard the night before. Footsteps leading into camp. He was pissed that we didn't tell him sooner, but the reality was, it didn't matter. Once he calmed down, we all decided what to do. I told him I had a buck down, and I wanted Don's help getting it dressed and broken down. They both agreed, and Kyle said he was going to reposition himself a little closer to where we were, just in case that weirdo decided to show up again. Don and I were well out of earshot before we started talking, really hashing the whole thing out. All right, so what did this guy look like? I asked. Tall, skinny, dirty as hell. He was wearing an old flannel jacket with a hood, work boots, and just generally unkempt. Don explained. You think he lives out here? Oh yeah, for sure, came the response. We arched back towards those rock features that I downed my buck near. And I heard something weird, something we couldn't place. Don and I shared another look as we separated and approached the clearing from different angles. Don didn't have a gun on him, but he was a body, and he kept an 8-inch trail knife on his belt. We crept into that clearing, and to my absolute shock, there was nothing there. And I mean nothing, not even my kill. There was a very clear blood trail that stretched off into the woods, and Don and I wasted no time following it. My first initial thought was a big predator, probably a bear or a cougar, had come along, found that buck, and started hauling it off for dinner. I figured if we chased it down quick enough, we might be able to salvage it. I was really kicking myself in the ass for not just nutting up and dressing that kill earlier. Wasting time led to the situation at hand. As we cut through a ravine, the blood was getting thicker. I bet if I knelt down and put a finger in it, it'd still be warm. We pushed over the next ridge and across another ravine, maybe 100 yards away. I see the guy Don was talking about. Dirty as shit, wild hair, weird dated flannel clothing, and he's dragging my buck up the slope of the next ridgeline. Again, he's only 100 yards away, but with the terrain, it'd take 5 minutes to get across. He'll disappear over the next hill before we can get to him. Hey! The hell are you doing? I hollered out. The guy didn't even react at all. Hey, man! Hey! Don yelled up at him, and he had a much deeper voice. This time, the guy looked up and gave a head nod. This is fucking crazy. So I did the only thing I could really think of. I raised up my barrel and piped up a round into the sky. Not the best gun safety etiquette I know, but with the weird situation at hand, I think I get a pass. Either way, the guy finally reacted, and that made me feel a little bit better. At least I know he was human. He was actually there and not just some kind of hallucination. Now that the chamber was empty, I shouldered my rifle and looked down range. It was the only way I could get a good look at the guy. He looked like nothing I've ever seen before. He must have had jaundice or something similar. His skin was this weird yellow, almost ashy looking texture. Huge patches of hair was missing all over his head, and believe it or not, I'm pretty sure he only had one eye. One socket was red rimmed and crusted with yellow. The other was just a black hole in his face. The other thing that was weird is he didn't seem to struggle dragging this buck carcass uphill. He'd been doing it for a quarter of a mile. I could see veins and cords of muscles bursting up his arms, chest, and neck. Get this. He looked over at me once, saw me looking at him through the scope, and fucking smiled at me. The most gnarled, nasty smile that I've ever seen. Like he was born with a can of tobacco in his mouth. Missing teeth, gum rot, everything you could imagine. And yeah, I did see this all through a scope. Like I said, the guy was barely 100 yards away. I could count the hairs on his chin with the glass I have on that rifle. He gave me another snaggletooth grin, then he and the deer disappeared over the hillside. Don and I looked at one another in total shell shock, unsure if we should keep pressing after him. Obviously we did, at least for a little bit, but once he got beyond that ridge, there was no catching up. He was fast. Honestly, that blood trail had all but disappeared now. It was like the ground swallowed the guy right up. We turned around and met up with Kyle on the hike back. He came humping after us the second he heard my warning shot. We explained the absolute batshit story, and unbelievably, Kyle believed every word of it. Since being stalked by that guy, he was on board with whatever we heard or whatever we saw. He turned out to be a good companion on the trip. Security type of guy, willing to take the first watch and pull the trigger if he had to. The wild part, Kyle actually went out in the night and stalked around himself, looking for the guy. He followed the gore from my buck back into the gully and came back around 3 a.m. Said he didn't see anything more. but he thought he heard somebody tuning a guitar at one point. He chalked it up to exhaustion, but he really wanted to find out whoever that was. Don spent the rest of his trip praying and reading his Bible in his free time. The encounter really put a damper on his spirit. I did the only thing I could think of and went out and bagged another buck the next day. This time, I dressed it in the moment instead of putzing around. We've all gone back to hunt and hike that same stretch of forest, and haven't seen that guy since. We've talked to all manner of folks who know that area, even better than me, and they've never heard of anything like that story. I like to think it's a one-off, but how the hell could that be? The autumn air clung to our skin like a damp shroud, and the leaves crunched under my boot as we stepped out of our grandpa's farm. Flynn, my younger brother, and I were on the cusp of something new, a hunt that would forever etch itself into our memories. The kind of memory that curls up in the darkest corner of your mind, waiting to uncoil when you least expect it. Our father had always taken us on small hunts, birds, squirrels, the occasional rabbit, but this time it was different. This time, we were alone, and given the green light to venture out together. The family farm now sprawled out before us, its fields fading into the horizon, and beyond that, the woods. Dad drove us out there, the past familiar red barn, passing some grazing cows, then into the wilderness due west. The truck bumped along the dirt road, rattling our bones. I glanced over at Flynn. His knuckles were white, gripping the edge of the seat. We'd never been this far from home without our dad, but he assured us Grandpa's property was very safe. He'd only be a couple of miles down the road if anything happened. The clearing appeared like a secret unveiled. Trees encircled it, their gnarled branches reaching out for the sky. Inside the center, a pristine creek meandered, its water a mirror reflecting the fading sun. Dad helped us unpack the old canvas tent, the lantern, and our archery gear. His eyes held this mix of pride as well as nostalgia. "This is where I grew up hunting, boys," he said, his voice low, as if sharing forbidden knowledge. "It's the best spot around." He pointed out the perfect spot for our tent, where the morning sun wouldn't pierce our eyelids as it rose. He showed us where to scout for tracks and scat, the signs of life that would lead us to our prey. And then, with a knowing smile, he whispered about the terrain features, the hidden hollows, the ancient boulders, and places where the forest almost seemed to hold its own breath. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Dad packed up. "Be back in a couple of days," he said, his hand resting on my shoulder. "Boys, take care, and remember what I taught you. If anything happens, fire 2 shots every couple of hours. Grandpa will come find you." Flynn nodded, his eyes wide. I swallowed the lump in my throat. Bittersweet, that's what this was. Excitement tangled with fear. Alone in the wilderness with only each other and the whispering woods before us. At first, night settled upon us like a heavy quilt. We gathered around a small campfire, its flames dancing in the darkness. The creek murmured nearby, the wind rustled the leaves. Flynn's eyes darted from shadow to shadow. "What if we're not alone out here?" he said. I chuckled, trying to mask my own unease. "It's just the animals, little brother. Owls, maybe a raccoon or two." "Are any bears out here?" I shrugged. Honestly, I didn't know. But the woods had other plans. The wind shifted from deep within the trees. A sound emerged. A soft, haunting melody. It wasn't the wind or the creek, it was a whisper. A secret shared between the ancient pines. Flynn's grip immediately tightened on the archery bow. "What's that?" he asked, his voice barely even audible. I leaned in closer, my heart pounding, The woods have memories, Flynn. They remember every hunter who's ever walked these paths, every creature who's met its end. They remember everything spoken within them. Sometimes, they say it back. Flynn lost all color in his face. I'm just fucking with you, man. It's the wind. Do you know what I wish it was? He leaned in close to hear me. I wish it was a bunch of strippers, butt naked, coming to give us lap dances all night long. That's what I wish. We both start laughing, and then drone off into the endless daydreams and fantasies that young boys have. I was 15 or 16 on this trip, so I thought I had the world of sex and romance pretty much figured out. And in my mind, being surrounded by strippers was the pinnacle of it all. Flynn was only 13 or so. Anything involving naked women was a thumbs up immediately from him. The wind swirled around us, weaving through the darkness. It was beautiful and mournful, like a lullaby for lost souls. I glanced over toward the creek, half expecting to see a figure emerge. A phantom hunter, perhaps, or a ghostly deer. Flynn leaned in. Dad said this was the best spot, right? He did, I replied, but he never mentioned it being this creepy. We huddled closer together and made some s'mores. The fire crackled and cast some flickering shadows on the tent. As the night deepened, the shadows enveloped us, promising secrets and danger, memories as well as dread. That night, we listened to the wind, to the creek, and to the haunting melody that echoed through time. Somewhere out there, beyond the firelight, something watched us. A presence older than memory, waiting for dawn to reveal its secrets, or at least, that's what I kept telling Flynn. What kind of older brother would I be if I didn't fill his mind with nightmare fuel, just before bed, out in the middle of nowhere? And so began our archery hunt, one autumn. 2 brothers and some inexplicable craziness. Flynn and I rose before the sun, our breath visible in the chill. We scarfed down a quick breakfast, some cold beans from a can, and then washed it down with creek water. The anticipation just hummed between us, a shared secret. Today, we'd prove ourselves as hunters, not just boys playing at it. Our gear was very basic: bows, arrows, waters, compass, and binoculars. Dad's old hunting knife hung from my belt, the blade worn but sharp. We stepped out into the forest, trees swallowing us whole. Tracks were there, fresh impressions from the dew-kissed earth. Deer, unmistakable. Their hooves had left a signature, a promise of life and death. Flynn's eyes gleamed. Big ones, he whispered. Healthy. I nodded. Let's go. We moved silently, our boots brushing pine needles. The forest held its breath, as if it was aware of our intent. The tracks led us deeper, winding through dense underbrush. The sun peeked over the horizon, casting long shadows. We continued to push forward, the thrill of the hunt urging us on and on. And then we spilled out onto the lakeside. The water lay still, a mirror reflecting the sky. A quarter of a mile away, along the shore, a deer grazed, a small herd, oblivious to our presence. Their heads dipped, antlers glinting early in the light. Flynn's grip tightened on his bow and he charged on without me. I immediately matched his intensity. We became shadows, stalking along the tree line. Those deer were close now, their breath visible in the crisp air. We continued moving like ghosts, our hearts pounding along the way. The largest one, a buck with antlers like twisted branches, stood apart. His eyes were scanning the surroundings, weary but not alarmed. Flynn knocked an arrow, his movements fluid. It was a crack shot, and I trusted him. I signaled for him to take the shot. He drew the bowstring, eyes locked on that buck. The world narrowed to just that moment. The tension, the promise of meat for our family. Flynn was younger, a total goofball. but he was actually a better shot than me and a better tracker. I don't know what it was about him, but he was just good at it, all of it. He had this natural ability, but more than that, he operated at an almost instinctual level. He didn't need to look when planting his feet, didn't need to adjust his arrow at all. He aligned his body with the bow and just took a long, steady aim. The arrow flew, an exhale of death. It struck true, piercing the buck's side. But the animal was too big, too strong. It staggered and then bolted, crashing through the underbrush. Flynn's face fell immediately. "I missed," he muttered. "Nah, it's just tough. Come on, let's go," I hollered at him, yanking him back to reality as I bolted after the wounded animal. It took him a second, but I could hear Flynn's boots gaining ground behind me. This wasn't over. Shit, it was just starting. I tracked down many wounded critters with my dad. I had a lot of fun doing so as well. We sprinted after that deer. Blood had sprayed the ferns, a crimson trail leading us deeper into the woods. The buck was panicked, springing left and right, desperate to escape. But it stayed close to the lakeside, as if drawn to the water. We continued chase, our breaths very ragged. The forest blurred in front of us, a blur of green and brown, heartbeat and blood. The deer stumbled, its legs weakening. We continued to close in, our boots splashing in the shallows. The buck collapsed, its eyes wide with terror. Flynn knelt beside it, his hands trembling. "Finish it," he said, pinning the animal at the shoulders. His fire surprised the hell out of me, motivated me to do the deed. I raised up the hunting knife, its blade catching the light. The buck's breath came in ragged. I hesitated, then drove the blade home. As the blood soaked my hands, the deer's eyes dimmed. It was over. The same death blow I'd seen my dad deliver 100 times over. Clean and precise, right between the ribs. The heart is low in a deer, and with a decent-sized knife, you can end it all really quick. We stood there, panting, the lake lapping at our boots. The forest holding its breath once more. We'd just taken a life, a pact with nature, a reminder of our place within the cycle. Flynn wiped his face, smearing blood across his cheek. "We did it," he said. "Fuck, man, we did it." I couldn't help but smile. I always thought it was funny when he said a bad word. But the woods whispered, not a victory, but something deeper, a knowledge older than time. The blood trail had led us here, to this lakeside, where life met death. As the sun climbed higher, casting shadows upon the water, I wondered about what other secrets the forest held, what other hunt awaited us, hungry and patient. And then I realized it actually wasn't the forest whispering. I could actually hear people off to my right, somewhere near the lake. We had just started the gut job when I had that realization. I looked off in their direction, but Flynn didn't seem to notice. He was totally engulfed in the task at hand. Hey, you hear that?" I asked to get his attention. "Hear what?" he said, wiping a blood-stained hand across his brow. "Voices." "Probably just somebody fishing," Flynn said, turning back to the deer. "You don't go fishing to talk," I said. "You go fishing to get away from talking." Flynn looked back up and cocked his head. That was an old saying of our dad's to get us to shut the fuck up, and it was 100% true. I put my stuff down and started creeping down the shore in the direction of those voices. Flynn just a few steps behind. We crept along the waterway, our boots sinking into the mud. The voices grew louder, giggles and hushed conversations. And then we saw them, heads bobbing in the murky water. A family, perhaps, but something was off. Their skin too pale, their eyes too wide. They were pretty far off, but I could tell something was weird about them. Flynn's hand tightened immediately on his bow. "The hell is this?" He was smart to bring it along. I watched them swim and splash one another. As I counted their heads, 5 in all, I realized there was only one man, an adult with dark hair and a bushy beard. All the rest were girls, like kids. All around the same age as me and Flynn, I think. I feel like any other circumstance, I would have found this exciting, but because they were all clearly naked, it turned my stomach. Something was just off, something weird. Couldn't put my finger on it, but my instincts were telling me. "Come on, let's just get out of here," Flynn said, as if he read my mind. But then the guy looked over at us and waved. We were in pure shock, total disbelief. We did our best to tuck into the bushes and keep our heads down, but something had gave us up. He came swimming over right away, leaving the girls out in slightly deeper water. He had a huge smile on his face, almost seemingly too big for his face. "You boys lost?" I hesitated. "We're, hunting deer." The man's laughter echoed. Deer in these woods. You're either brave or stupid." His gaze passing back between me and Flynn, assessing. But it was the swimmers who unnerved me, and I don't really know why. They just looked on nonchalantly, whispering underneath their breath. They all looked like they could be related, pale, blonde, dead-eyed in the water. "Well, I literally just bagged one," Flynn said, gesturing over his shoulder. The man's grin widened. "Ah, good. Thought the water tasted funny." He beckoned to the girls. "Take a big drink, girls." They all collectively went under the water for a moment, came up and swallowed a mouthful of water. It was by far the creepiest thing I'd ever seen in all my teenage life. We didn't have the internet when this happened, so I wasn't exposed to seeing anything like that. Flynn looked horrified, awkwardly opening and closing his mouth as if he wanted to say something but couldn't. The next thing we know, the man is getting out of the water, waving for the girls to do the same. I don't know how we missed it, but all their stuff was laid out right on some rocks down below. All of them were butt naked. The guy put on a pair of jeans and the girls all pulled slips over their heads, like a little white gown. Flynn and I really didn't know what to do, other than just turn around and start walking back toward our kill. Naturally, the man and the girls followed behind. I'd say maybe 20 steps behind us. I went numb when I looked back and saw that he was holding hands with the tallest girl, probably the oldest one. Such an open display of sick behavior. I realized right away this was a mistake. This guy was capable of anything. I gripped the handle of the knife on my belt and wondered what he was capable of too. For whatever reason, we inadvertently led them over to our kill, and I made a mental note to myself not to let them go any further with us closer to our camp. The idea of those weirdos knowing where we were sleeping that night really made my skin crawl. All the while, I could hear the man whispering to the girls behind us. As to what he was saying, I can't really say. We came around to the place where we left the deer. I could hear the man audibly gasp. I turned around and he gestured to the carcass. "Well done," he started. "May I?" He raised his hand to the deer. Flynn and I awkwardly nodded. We watched in disbelief as the man slowly approached our kill, whispering to himself, and reaching up inside where we'd start to quarter the hind end. He pulled out a palm of blood and gore. Still whispering, he painted a symbol on his forehead, and one by one, the girls came over to him. He painted something similar on theirs. "Who killed it?" the man asked. Flynn slowly raised his hand. I almost wanted to take credit just because I didn't know what this guy was about to do, but he waited for Flynn to approach him, who took a few shaky steps over. The man took 2 fingers and made a 5-pointed star on his forehead and a dot on each cheek, a totally different sign than what he and the girls had. Now, don't wash it off, okay? God's watching." Flynn nodded, but I didn't make eye contact. The man went over and kissed each of the girls on the head, then led them back into the forest and away from the lake. They didn't have shoes or anything of the sort. Just walked barefoot deeper into the wilderness. The man took the hand of the tall girl and gave her a real kiss. Then they all started humming or singing. It was too far away to tell. Flynn and I got back to work, butchered up that deer, got it all packed up, and headed back to camp within a few hours. We didn't see that group of people again, thank God. But we were constantly looking over our shoulders just in case. We had no idea who they were, and personally, I was scared shitless. Not just for me, but for my little brother. When those people approached, I just froze up. I realized I might not have it in me to protect us. I almost wanted to use that handgun to pipe some rounds into the air, get Dad or Grandpa to immediately come over. We didn't though, insisted that it was just whatever. I ended up bagging my own deer the next day, hunting in an area well away from the lake, and after that, decided it was time to go home. We had a lot of meat, probably 150 pounds between both animals, plenty enough for the rest of the year. We held out for the rest of the trip, but we weren't very comfortable. The strangest part was we never really talked about it. We discussed it briefly that first night after the initial encounter, dismissed it as hippie weirdos and just tried to forget about it. When Dad got there, we never said a word. To this day, I don't know why we kept our mouths shut. Something about that encounter scared us so deeply, we didn't even want to mention it. Talking about it just brought this certain reality that we didn't want to speak into existence. Around 15 years later, there was a cult that got busted in that exact same area. My brother and I saw the mugshots, but we didn't recognize any of them. Still, the overlap in the reports was uncanny. We don't know if there's a direct connection, but it put both of our minds at ease, if I'm being honest. Definitely has to be the weirdest memory I have from any of my hunting trips, though. Hey Booze, I wanted to submit this story before you blow up much more and I don't have a chance to hear you narrate it. This one is for the books, at least in my life, and falls under a range of categories. Hunting, deep woods, middle of nowhere, even true crime. My little day hunt turned into one of the weirdest experiences of my entire life. I remember it like it happened yesterday. The chill in the air, the dampness of my clothes, and the anticipation that comes with a solitary hunt. I was a man who relished the quiet of the wilderness, the primal connection to something ancient and untamed. Bird hunting was my escape, my way of shedding the trappings of civilization, becoming one again with nature. I lived in a very remote town, where the roads twisted and turned like the veins of some kind of forgotten junkie. My house, a modest cabin nestled among the pines, was my personal sanctuary. Camping wasn't necessary. I could step out my door and be swallowed by the forest itself. That morning, before the sun even dared to peek over the horizon, I left my cabin, my old truck rumbling to life. The map lay spread across the passenger seat. I traced my finger along the dirt roads, seeking the perfect spot for my hunt. I drove maybe 15 miles, all of it dirt road, till I rambled into the sticks, middle of nowhere public land that I've been shooting at for years. There were several pockets that I used to use out here to hunt different stuff, but as mentioned, bird hunting was just my jam. It didn't require the same kind of focus, and the payoff was always a haul. I parked my truck in this little pullout along the road and studied the map. As I sat there sipping coffee from my battered thermos, I noticed a flicker of light in the trees. It danced like a firefly, elusive and strange. I squinted, waiting for it to reappear, but it vanished into the shadows. seasonal lightning, I thought, dismissing it as a trick of the dawn. I killed my engine and shouldered my backpack, adjusted my face cover, the familiar ritual of a seasoned hunter. The woods beckoned me, and I followed that faint trail, guided by instinct rather than logic. The flash of light, now forgotten, had led me in this direction. Birds weren't my primary concern. The thrill of the hunt, the pulse of life in the wilderness. I wanted to immerse myself, to feel the earth beneath my boots, and let the forest consume me. I pressed on for a mile or two, just losing myself in the woods. The sun finally emerged, casting a long shadow through the trees. And there, in the distance, something else caught my eye. A white van, standing out against the backdrop of green and brown. It sat like a stranded whale, half a mile from the nearest road, wedged between rocks and tangled branches. It couldn't have been there for very long. The tires were still fresh from the asphalt. My stomach tightened, a warning from deep within. I circled the van, scanning for any signs of life. "Hello? Hello?" I called, but my voice was swallowed by the silence. I got no response. The passenger door hung open, only an inch or so, but it was an invitation. Cigarette butts littered the passenger floorboard, mingling with the discarded lotto tickets and grimy baby clothes. The scene was absurd, like a twisted tableau from a forgotten nightmare. Curiosity drove me to the back hatch. I pulled it open, revealing a trail of blood, a crimson ribbon leading into the van's dark interior. Something had been dragged across the floor, leaving this grotesque imprint. I recoiled, my skin prickling with unease. The driver's window revealed smashed gauges, a steering wheel coated in dried blood and strands of hair. The van reeked of decay, secrets buried too deep. I should have fled, but duty compelled me. I needed to report this. An abandoned van, a crime scene, hidden in the heart of the forest. Yet, inexplicably, I decided to complete my hunt first. The birds awaited, oblivious to the horror nearby. I bagged my prey, each shot echoing like a distant scream. It took me a couple of hours, the rest of the morning I'd say, before I circled back for the truck. I secured all my belongings, loaded up my kills, and then blasted off for civilization. Back on the main road, I called the sheriff's department. The dispatcher's voice was calm, detached. "We know about the van," she said. "Investigated it last week. No foul play." "But," I stammered, "there's a blood trail." "Already on our radar," she assured me. "Don't worry." "Listen, lady, I really don't think we saw the same van here. The one that I'm reporting has a steering wheel caked in blood and human hair. Your report have that?" Now the dispatcher got quiet. I could hear mouse clicks and shuffling papers. "We'll dispatch another deputy. Thank you for the call." I hung up, bewildered. How could they dismiss this? The van haunted my thoughts, its malevolence seeping into my bones. A few months later, I returned to that same exact spot. The van was now gone, but the cigarette butts remained. New ones, as if somebody kept coming back to smoke in that desolate place. That itself was almost just as creepy. Who was driving and then walking miles and miles into the wilderness just to smoke a pack of cigarettes? I don't really have any explanation, only dread. The forest holds its secrets, and sometimes they choose to reveal themselves. I will never forget that van, the blood, or the eerie certainty that evil lingers where we least expect it.